this is like the fifth time in Act 3 that Oliver has brought up that they're not allowed back in the castle. Like, even after Thanksgiving break, they're not allowed back into the castle, which is their dormitory, till after 4. And it's a red flag to me because why is he bringing it up? Why is he pointing it out? I don't know. But to me, it's standing out that the police obviously did not believe in the accident theory. Yes, they're the ones that closed the case, supposedly saying that Richard died by an accident, but obviously they don't fully believe that because they would have let the students back into their dorms if they did, but they didn't. They're not allowed back in their dorms for quite a while, which means that they've been peeling and looking through the castle, looking for clues and evidence. So that stands out to me because how would they have not found the bloody weapon, which James supposedly would have shoved into his bed that Oliver just happens to see while he's just cleaning the room? The police would have found it. It would have stood out. They would have seen it. If Oliver could find it, they would have found it, especially if they're actually actively looking for something like that. So to me, this read through, I'm definitely more suspicious of Oliver, but now I'm starting to wonder if James never had done that. The weapon was never in his mattress. Instead, Oliver, let's say, had done it and just automatically brought it to the place that he had supposedly brought it after finding it in James's bed, which is in the basement of the theater, in that like random locker in the storage room. Like, what if it was always just there? But now he's trying to paint the picture as if James had done it. Okay, it's also interesting that Oliver points out like they don't know about, and they haven't heard anything about Ren. They don't know if she's coming back. Meredith's delayed on her flight back, and like he's with Pip and Alexander at the pub. But James is having tea with Frederick. And like, yes, I know that they're close and they definitely have this mentor pupil kind of relationship going on, but I don't know. It's interesting that Frederick would have tea with only James immediately after coming back from break. So now I'm starting to wonder, like, why? What is happening? What is the intention of this? It could be benign. It could be just talking about, the kind of roles James would like to do for the spring semester. But like, I don't know. Why? Why have this tea? And why have Oliver pointed out to us? Because it's been a decade. It's been 10 years. That is such a benign detail that he would have forgotten it. So why point it out to us unless it was important, or he's fictionalizing it? And then why is he fictionalizing it? I'm so suspicious. Now, things just happen sometimes. Just coincidences do happen, but I don't know. And maybe it's just the author showing. Maybe I'm looking too hard into it. But the fact that, like, Oliver just so happens this year, halfway through the year, to need all of a sudden a work study or a scholarship. And then all of a sudden be charged with the cleaning and maintenance of the castle, their dorm, the same place that he finds the evidence. Like, it's suspicious to me. And I don't know if it's just like the author had needed a way to show to us that like how he came across the evidence. Was he always doing a work study? But like, why put him at the castle like cleaning that? Like, I've never heard of a work study doing that personally, but I don't know. Like, it's a red flag to me, but I don't know what to think about it, to be honest. This is why the story makes me feel like I'm losing my mind, and I'm like Charlie from I'm Always Sunny with my corkboard with all the red string. Like, it's the little details, because we have to remember, again, it's a decade later. He's telling us these little details a decade later. No one's memory is that perfect, so he's definitely fictionalizing parts of this. But like, it's the little details of him like being like, the castle was so cold, winter crept in, I lit a fire. He started shoving a few pieces of newspaper from the basket on the hearth and wedged them underneath 2 new logs without cleaning any of the old ashes. So, like, why that detail is important? Why was the detail that he didn't clean the ashes important to us? Was it just to show, like, how, like, inept he was at cleaning? But they had to have started fires before. Like, he had to have done it before. But also, like, I'm curious of, like, does the dorm not have, like, actual, like, heating that they have to rely on a sole fireplace? Like, I'm so curious about that. But, like, what was the point of him bringing up the ashes, except to maybe remind us of what Pip was doing before a break, how he came across her with the fire? Was she burning evidence? But, like, still, what is with the ashes? Once again, I am just so suspicious of Oliver this read through. I never really thought this hard about Oliver and what he said and did. But him being like, assuming automatically that was Alexander that had come into the house. It's not Alexander, but like, why didn't he think it was Alexander and Pip when supposedly he had just seen them at the pub, like left them at the pub together? Why wouldn't it be both of them? But just Alexander. But what I'm going to bring up is the fact that he had rushed hoping to figure out some reason, a plausible excuse of why he was there early, without burdening him or any others with my family drama. We had enough drama of our own, which to me flags as he like plausible deniability, kind of like if say Colburn did go to ask Alexander or any of the others, like, hey, was this really happening in Oliver's life? Was he having this family situation? They wouldn't know because he wouldn't have told them, is what he's very much explaining to us. And quickly, to prove what I said in the beginning of this scene of how it's suspicious that the students weren't allowed back into the castle for this long, obviously it's pointing that they were suspicious of that it wasn't an accident death. We have this obvious interaction of Oliver overhearing Colburn investigating and overhearing his conversation. But what stands out to me is that the last time I read this book, I categorized anything he said to Colburn as being completely true because Colburn was actually there. You can't lie to him. But now I'm starting to wonder if this isn't actually him talking to Colburn. That this is him writing the story down after he had talked to Colburn. This is him now so separate that he is not writing this down. But we also have to remember, he wouldn't know the exact dialogue, neither would Colburn, but Colburn would remember probably a little bit more than Oliver would because he would know more so what he would say. So like, I don't know what to think of this scene because the last time I really thought like, all right, this is 100% true because he's telling the story to Colburn, but now I'm like, probably still not true because what if he's just only telling the story to us? I highlighted this line the last time I annotated this book, and I wondered if he could see the dock from where he was standing, and I bet you can see the dock from the castle? We didn't know this detail leading up to this point, which now makes it even more suspicious because who's to say that no one would have seen the crime actually happening then? Because even if, say, the party was over when they had followed after Richard, the rest of them were still hovering around. They were still dealing with things, especially say if Ren was still outside when supposedly James had gone after Richard. Wouldn't they have seen this happening? Wouldn't they have seen or heard Richard falling into the water? So why didn't they? And now I'm so much more like my my entire idea and like mental image of how the crime could have happened, whether it was James, Oliver, Meredith, whoever, it's now going out the window because now I'm wondering, how did they not hear it? How did they not see it if you can supposedly see the dog from the castle? There's this little detail that Oliver has where he's overhearing Colburn saying, like, talking to another investigator when the other investigator says, is this the first time they've lost a student? A dancer committed suicide about 10 years ago, found out she didn't make the cut for fourth year, went up to her room and slit her wrist. And it's Oliver adding to his argument of, the blame, pushing the blame onto everyone and everything other than himself and sometimes his friends, pushing the blame on this university that they had fostered this environment that led to this crime, that led to students, for instance, committing suicide. That no, he wouldn't want to leave Delacour. He would do anything to stay at Delacour, obviously, even despite this very intense, very toxic atmosphere that is installed at this university. And it's also the fact that she didn't make the cut for fourth year. It just made me then think of Oliver because he barely made the cut. So what would he have done if he didn't? I also really love this interaction that Oliver's overhearing because on one note, it is presenting Oliver's side of the argument that you could partially blame the university for the events that happened, that they had pushed them to past their limits to reach the point where they could not only commit this crime but then justify it. But then you have Colburn, which is he's presenting the other side of the argument of this, of no, you can't blame the university. You still had agency over your own actions, which goes into Oliver's theme of fate versus agency. I feel a little validation for keeping Meredith kind of high up on my suspect list. It goes Oliver, and then probably a tie between James and Meredith. When the one officer goes, do you think that's why no one's pointing at her after learning that her family is rich, makes fancy watches? So obviously the other officer is looking at her first, which makes sense. You do look immediately towards partners, spouses, those kind of people, immediate people in your life when it comes to a crime like this. So obviously they think that she is potentially capable. And I do too. Okay, once again, we don't know for sure if Oliver is fictionalizing this conversation that he overheard from Colburn, if we are to believe what is being said here. At the very least, when it comes to Oliver and Meredith's relationship, we can say that they at least kissed. They at least made out, from him saying that, couldn't say, but apparently the two of them had a knockdown, drag out fight in front of everyone, and by the end of the night, she was making out with someone else. So at the very least, we can assume that, but we can't assume that he is right when he says that they had like a sexual relationship going forward. Even the way that, like, James says that he hooked up with the hottest girl in our year. Hookup could mean make out. It could mean sex, but it could also mean make out, depending on the particular person's definition of it. So he could have only simply made out with Meredith. That was the extent of the relationship. That maybe that was it. And now he's just trying to amp himself up because he likes the attention and the awe he gets from everyone when they learn that maybe he did have sex with her. Wait, even more. You can't even assume that he made out with Meredith because Colburn answers Walton when he said, "Who is that?" With who made out with Meredith. Nobody really wants to say, but someone suggested Oliver Marks, another fourth year. And so she could have potentially made out with someone else, but now he's trying to take the credit because no one really truly knew. But the fact that no one really wanted to say is interesting to me, that the crowd who probably live on gossip didn't want to say that. So why wouldn't they say who was making out with Meredith to the police? So like that's interesting to me, and I don't know how to unpack that. It's the little things that like makes me laugh and points to why I don't believe in Meredith and Oliver actually had a relationship. It's things like this, of like Colburn saying like some people thought it was Oliver Marks that made out of her. He admitted to going upstairs with her, but according to him, they were just talking. Walton, seems unlikely. Colburn, you haven't seen this girl. You don't understand how unlikely. Like, no one believes that they would have hooked up. So like, it's so interesting that this is the hill that Oliver wants to die on, even though he ridicules her and pushes her away. It's so like, it makes Oliver's character so fascinating, and I have fluctuated in my opinion of him so hard. Like, it's just wild how I thought of him every time I read this book. Because the first time I kind of liked him. Like, yeah, he wasn't perfect, but he was human. But I liked him, and I kind of saw him as like his hero complex that he was trying to present. But this time I'm like, oh, cringe. Like, he's reminded me a lot of like the Oliver from Saltburn. Oliver I'm seeing here, which also makes me think like I really love this author. It's the little details, because when Culver's describing what happened, he's like, no one knows, but they just know that Richard stormed off, grabbed a bottle of Glenfiddich, and heads outside. And I'm like, that is so specific of a like detail that, one, Oliver shouldn't in theory remember it 10 years later, and two, for the police, they wouldn't specifically say what specific brand of a bottle of alcohol you grabbed. They would just say that he grabbed a bottle of whiskey, but no, they said this. And this bottle of whiskey comes from Scotland, which Macbeth comes from Scotland. So there's a reason why Oliver is pointing to that detail, that the author is pointing to that detail, that without, painting a giant red arrow that's flashing lights, being like, hey, think of Macbeth, is this very subtle detail that if you take the time to look up, or you just happen to know that Glenfiddich comes from Scotland, then you'd be like, oh, Macbeth. So what does the scene have to do, and Richard's death have to do with Macbeth? And obviously a lot. And I guess I can probably tag my addendum video about Macbeth down below, because it's interesting. I thought this last time when I annotated this book, and I thought this again this time, that what Colburn says here could potentially be what actually happened. And Oliver maybe committed the crime, but now he's trying to fictionalize it all these years later. But what he says is that Ren, the cousin, tries to talk him down, but he shakes her off. Burrow's words, when I asked him what he meant, he clammed up. Makes me wonder if it might have been a little violent, because neither of them went after him. Anyway, Farrow stays with the cousin, and Richard disappears into the trees. Nobody sees him again until the following morning, when Alexander Vass, he's the last fourth year, goes down to the dock for a smoke and finds him in water. So we have about 3 hours where we don't know where Richard was or what he was up to. So to me, I think that could very potentially be what actually happened that night. We just don't know the 3-hour gap if Oliver said went after him following that. But the other interesting thing that caught my attention is that he goes, oh, Alexander, the last fourth year. He's missing one fourth year. Pip. So what does that say? Why was Pip forgotten? And that, like, Pip is such an interesting character, and I've seen so many people love her character. But, like, why was she forgotten by the police here? I think the really brilliant thing about this conversation is that it's putting a nail in the group's coffin that if, say, that what Oliver presents of all of them standing on the lake making this decision is true, they did technically murder him because he was in the lake, and yeah, they thought he was maybe alive but close to death anyway. But we learned, like, definitely from the police that he was definitely alive. He was just unconscious or stunned the moment he hit the lake, but he drowned was his cause of death. Really, like, there was a lot of face damage, but he would have he literally says the damage was bad but it shouldn't have been fatal. And so it's pointing that they could have saved him. There was a huge possibility that he could have lived, but they didn't. And they took the agency in that situation and chose to kill him in this way. However, what a red flag is for me is when Colburn says he drowned, in a manner of speaking, choked on his own blood. So you're telling us that you definitely know that he was alive when he hit the water, so you would assume he drowned and there would be water found in him. But you're saying that his cause of death was choking on his own blood, which then is, I don't know, like, it doesn't add up to me. I'm not an expert on this field by any stretch of the word, but it doesn't add up to me. You would think that it would be just plain drowning, but no, it's choked on his own blood, which now makes me once again wonder if he drowned before he hit the water, or like drowned in his own blood before he hit the water. Like, this, the math here is not mathing, in my opinion. But the other thing with Colburn telling us that he was alive before he hit the water, it would have been fatal, the damage to his face, but I mean, would have, the damage was bad but not fatal to his face, is pointing out that not only they had agency in this situation, but it's giving a justification of why Oliver is reacting so intensely in this moment, like, oh my god, I'm gonna be caught. Because if we didn't have that, I feel like in that conversation, then his reaction to the police just being there would feel a little bit more like he had a little bit more of a role in Richard's death. But because of this, and because of the scene that he had presented with all them standing by the lake and deciding to not save him, to let be, is giving us a justification of why maybe he didn't do this crime, and he's just worried that they're all going to be caught because they could have saved him and they didn't, if that makes sense. But like, they could argue in a court of law that they thought he already was dead when they came to it. So like, I again, like, as a human, you don't know how to react, and like, you would go to the worst possibility and you would probably panic. Like, I'm not discrediting him for that, but like, I don't know, I'm suspicious. But this moment, it gives it a little bit more validation of him maybe not committing this crime, if that makes sense. Remember back in the prologue when of Act 3, Oliver quoted Sembeline to Colburn and said, wherein I am false, I am honest, not true to be true. And I'm thinking that again when he overhears Colburn saying they're a bunch of fucking actors. They could be lying for all we know. And I think those two lines kind of play within each other, that they are lying. And I think that's Oliver saying, like, you weren't wrong, that we were lying, obviously, but where our lies were their equal truths. You just gotta really look for it. And this could be a red herring and just prove that like anyone is a suspect here. But like, when Walton says the money, my money's on the cousin, I'm like, why? Because she's the smallest of them, and like, I don't know, like, I guess because of the familiar ties, and you usually look within the family first when you look at crimes. But like, it could be a red herring, but like, it's interesting to have this detail brought up now. I want to point out that at the end of this scene, Oliver is having this imagined conversation with Richard where they're quoting Shakespeare back and forth to each other. And off the top of my head, I don't know how to unpack that. I just want to present it and put it forth between, to you, and wonder why you think this is here. Because I don't think at any other point in the story do we see him having this imagined conversation with Richard's ghost, only here. But why? And what does it mean? You can tell that Liz Offer puts a lot of thought into her settings and her stories and everything, because I really love in Act 3, Scene 12, it is mirroring Act 1, Scene 1, where in Act 1, Scene 1, you had all the players, as Oliver said, sitting around in the castle library, studying their notes, rehearsing, and it's the same, only here it's just the four of them. It's the boys and Pip, which she considered as one of the boys sometimes. But he's saying, like, the fire lit the whole room, but didn't chase away the cold entirely. And it's to show, like, the gaping holes. Like, the reason why it's not as cozy and warm as it had been in Act 1 is because you're missing 3 people in this little found family. When Oliver says they'd given me something surprisingly robust, Philip the Bastard's rousing speech, battle speech from King John. And I put it in my annotations that they were slowly and steadily altering the archetypes. He was given something surprising, he says, something robust, like he's slowly inching his way towards a role that might have gone to Richard, for instance. Oliver then gives us this monologue quote that he's seen. Your royal presence be ruled by me, be friends a while, and both conjointly bend your shaped deeds of malice on this town, and when that we have dashed them to the ground, why then defy each other and pell-mell, make work upon ourselves for heaven or hell? And I was looking up to see what the meaning could be behind this, because I don't know this play very well, obviously, or many Shakespeare plays, or the meanings behind some of them, and I found out that it is two different, like, it's by the same person, but two different like kind of quotes mashed together. So the first three lines is starts like 390 of the act, and the other half starts at like 420 of the act. And pretty much when you translate it, because I used like a website that translates it, is him pretty much saying, you know, kings, let's join together, be friends, and together we can crush this town. But when it is said and done, we will turn on one another pretty much. This is one of the many moments where I'm like doubting and questioning everything, and like I'm not certain. So when Ren appears, like, hello, sorry I'm late, James goes, Ren, and launched himself out of his chair. And I'm sitting here wondering, did he generally have feelings for Ren? And maybe, like, did he then also have feelings for Oliver? That's one possibility. Second possibility, he had feelings for Ren, never had feelings for Oliver, and Oliver's fictionalizing that. Third possibility, he did have feelings for Oliver, never had feelings for Ren, Oliver's fictionalizing it to add a little fun dynamic, Midsummer's Night Dream, jealousy aspect, because jealousy is a theme common in a lot of Shakespeare plays. Or D, he didn't have feelings for either of them, and he's still lying about both cases to add a romantic, jealous aspect to his play, to Oliver's play. Just like with my previous clip, it's the little details that makes me question the truth of what Oliver's trying to present to us, because the event has here where like Meredith comes out, you know, she was asleep, she was barefoot, barefaced, in leggings and a long t-shirt. I'm fairly sure I had once belonged to Richard. Obviously she hasn't moved completely on from Richard, despite what either Meredith is presenting up to this point or Oliver is presenting up to this point. So it also can apply to this theory that I have, that she saw Oliver as Richard's understudy. Not only did Gwendolyn threaten to have Oliver be Richard's understudy during Julius Caesar, but also in a later scene in this book, Oliver looks into the lake's water and notes that he looks not that dissimilar to Richard. He may not be as broad and big and, you know, demanding of a presence, but if you just limit the features to the bare minimum, they have similar coloring, for instance. Also, let's note, this is not the first time that Oliver has spent way more time describing how Meredith looks, down to, like, you know, what she's wearing, and her eyes, and her hair, and everything, way more than anyone else. Like, even in the scene, he does not describe what anyone looks like. Even Ren, when she just appeared, not on the same level that he describes Meredith. And he does this a handful of times, but the first thing that comes to mind is when he is describing them as the witches during Macbeth. Like, he kind of describes Pip and Ren, but not to the extent that he describes Meredith. So when Meredith did emerge from her room, she had a stern face, but it softened the minute that she saw Ren, and I think it's because they were being rowdy and she had been sleeping, and it was not just because they woke her up, but because I think even though she acts like she's ready to move on and was fine being without Richard, she still is mourning him and wants him to mourn him, and it seemed like they had moved on with their lives by being rowdy, and she came out to be mad at them for that, to be like, you know, I think she is mourning for Richard, to be honest. When James asks, where's your suitcase, Ren mentions that it's downstairs. I couldn't face carrying it up just yet, and in my annotation I did last year, I put halfway afraid of being back, of forgetting, and more moving on. Similar to Meredith, Ren hasn't fully committed to having her stuff brought back to this place because she's not fully committed to being back, and she's afraid that by being back it would mean that everyone would forget and move on, which is kind of the case. But simultaneously, Richard makes his presence very much known, even in death, that he makes it impossible to move on. So here's the thing with Oliver, because I'm more suspicious of him this time, I am flagging a lot more of the little things he says. Now, when he says that he considered running after Alexander and kicking him down the stairs, maybe on first impression, I just laughed. I guarantee I probably laughed my haha. But like the last time and this time, I mean, no, he's probably joking, but there's a hint of violence to it, and because I'm suspicious of him committing this crime, it's waving a red flag at me. But no, seriously, my feelings about Oliver has gone a complete 180 because the first time I actually listened to this as an audiobook, I liked him. I enjoyed him. I enjoyed hearing it from his perspective, and it's in part because it was an audiobook. But this time I'm like so frustrated and annoyed because here he's describing how him and Meredith didn't have a too dissimilar, holiday experience, that they don't like their family. They spent hours alone reading and staring at the ceiling. But she was alone, whereas he had the windfall of James's company. And I'm sitting here thinking, you didn't think that when he came. You were kind of petulant. You were kind of annoyed because you were planning on going to see Meredith. Like, he wasn't as excited as he could have been when James was there. Like, there were really cute moments between him and James during the scene, but he wasn't overjoyed to see James there. Like, he was relieved, like finally someone to commiserate with. He seemed annoyed. I felt like this the last time I read this because it was interesting because Meredith folds her arms and says, I'm going to bed unless you got something to say. And I'm like, why? You're not actually dating. He's not beholden to you. And like, why is she mad at him? So part of me is wondering, because it feels kind of out of the blue with how she was acting leading up to this point, with the fact, looking at the relationship and how it stands at this point, and all the other things surrounding this interaction, it makes me wonder if it didn't actually happen. But then he says that Meredith's like, the mask of empathy cracked for a moment. I saw the quiet disappointment underneath. And between this and between James, his recent interactions with both of them, it's like he's presenting it like they were testing him. And I'm like, why? Why are they testing you? And like, why is he acting like he's oblivious and stupid? And unless he's trying to present to Goldberg that he's oblivious and stupid, but hiding the truth of the situation, which is that he's much smarter than he is presenting himself as. Or he really was oblivious and stupid because he is kind of an oblivious, stupid guy. Who knows? He probably is that too. And when we get lines like this where Meredith says, I don't know, do you want to sleep with me or would you rather sleep with James? This isn't the first time we've had someone say a line very similar, hinting at a potential relationship between James and Oliver. So part of me is wondering, like, was there actually a relationship prior to this? Or does, like, just everyone knows and they're just waiting to see, like, is it actually true? But we're pretty certain it's probably true. If Oliver just gets his head out of his ass, maybe they would be in a relationship. Like, I don't know. But, like, he just throws these in. And I just, like, it's things like this that drives me crazy because I don't know what to think about it because I could literally go in a million directions with it. Oliver then says that his feet automatically brought him to the dock, and I'm like, but why? Wouldn't you be avoiding the place that, like, one of your classmates died and even if, say, you didn't murder him? Like, I would think you would avoid it. Plus, they always describe it as looking haunting. Like, you would, I don't know, you would avoid it, especially now. But he goes there, and so does Alexander, and I think it's done intentionally because we have to remember, take a step back and remind ourselves that Oliver is telling us this story. He's had a decade to write this tragic play that he is now performing for us. And so the settings in such plays are very important. So by bringing us back here is a reminder of all the building tension that we're starting to acquire in the last couple of scenes amongst this group. The focal point is this setting, is this lake, is this dock, and it's going to be pressing down on them more and more as the story continues. Once again, it's the tiny details that make the story even more amazing and why you should go back and reread such stories as this, because when Oliver is describing that there was no moon, just a small round gap in the field of stars where the moon should have been, I was like, why take the time to tell us that? And what's the symbolism of the moon? Because moon has symbolism. So when it's a moonless night, it represents a time of contemplation, to focus and think things through, and that is what is happening here with Oliver and Alexander. But the other thing about this description about the moonless night, just a round gap in the field of stars where the moon should have been, is that it mirrors the stage for King Lear, the way that that was set up at the very end with James and Oliver's performance. I highlighted the last time that Oliver notes Alexander there on the dock by himself. He must have heard me approach, but he didn't react, just sat staring at the lake with his hands folded between his knees, and I put an annotation saying, as though he is not afraid of the others coming upon him, which either he fully believes in the accident theory, or say we shouldn't completely cross him off the list of suspects, but like the fact that he isn't scared of someone coming up upon him at the very scene that this happened is interesting. Or Alexander could just be someone that loves to flirt with death, as we see a little bit later. Maybe he is already starting to feel the guilt and the pressure that will build to his accidental or maybe intentional overdose. I can't tell you why, because Alexander would be the obvious suspect, but for me, every time I read this book, I always saw what he did, except for maybe the first time when I was first listening to it, but every time after that, I've always thought Oliver trying to present Alexander as red herring because he's the most obvious. Him with his villain typecast, the villainous ways, the way he acts, and even, him saying right now, you think he suspects something, Alexander asked. To someone who didn't know him so well, he might have sounded scared. There were so many times that, it seems like he would have suggested it, so I feel like it's a red herring, unless we go with my Murder on Orient Express theory, which is that they all committed this crime together. That maybe Alexander suggested it, but they all followed through with it, just the same as with Julius Caesar. He suggested it, but they all acted on it together. Once again, Oliver is kind of sliding subtly the smoking gun on the table when he says something like, if we'd all lie to one another the way we'd lie to Colburn, I couldn't finish the thought. It's pretty much telling the audience that the reason why there's plot holes and you're not going to be satisfied by the end of the story is that I don't know the full narrative, which makes sense as a first-person narrator who is also unreliable. But it adds to the story. I love that it adds to the story because we never know fully what the truth is, because the thing is, with everyone's actions and words and intentions, not only do we not know if they're being truthful or deceitful, but we also don't know if Oliver is fictionalizing it, for instance. In the previous page, Oliver said, for someone that loves words so much sometimes it slips my mind, it is a subtle reminder for us to be conscious of the word choicing. And I'm saying that here because when Oliver says, just curious, I missed everything that happened after I went upstairs. I don't think I can remember any other moment in time in this book where Oliver or any of the others said something like They're very precise with the words, especially because Oliver, again, a reminder, this is Oliver's tragic play that he's been writing for the last decade. Him putting in it should be a red flag to us. It should be a signal that he's not telling the truth here. So to me, in my personal opinion, him and Meredith's relationship, they didn't really have sex. And who's to say that he was even up there the entire time? This could be hinting that he had left at one point to go follow Richard. So we know that in Julius Caesar, at least according to Oliver again, Gwendolyn threatened to have Oliver be, Richard's understudy to replace him. And as Oliver describes, he looks kind of like Richard. We see him trying to sidle and date Meredith, replacing him there. But the thing is that we also have Colin. And in Act 1, Colin is described as a year below's version of Richard, that he may not look exactly like him, but he played all the same roles. And he is just the nicer version of Richard. But when Richard is gone, we see Colin kind of does fill that gap. We see Colin start to appear within the group a lot more going forward, but yet they don't see him as Richard's replacement, or at least Oliver does not present him like that, because I think Oliver is vying for that position for himself, and that's why he doesn't present Colin as Richard's replacement as the story goes forward. But if you take a step back, Colin kind of did fill that gap. Once again, Oliver's presenting a very interesting opinion of Meredith, and it's very subtle because it's here he quotes Much Ado About Nothing, but Alexander, I go for every guy's name and remember who I'm trying to say. There's too many guys. Look who's talking. Fuck's sake, she started it. Obviously, no offense, Oliver, but starting things isn't exactly your MO. And it's trying to be like, oh, pity me, I was seduced. Is kind of the subtle way he's trying to present things. Like, oh, I was seduced by her. Like, oh, woe is me. Like, I'm just the hero guy, which goes into this very archetype of her being the femme fatale. And I hate, he pines for her, but then he paints her like this. So here's the moment I've been kind of referencing for a while now, which is on page 215 of my copy. And he says that he looks in the water and the realization hit me like a blow to the stomach. With my dark hair a little wilder than usual and my blue eyes hollowed out by the weak starlight, I almost resembled Richard. And in a previous video I posted last year, I brought this up and I said, so he's the bargain version of Richard, and he's the replacement. But it's, I think, to represent that he does kind of look like Richard, and he is vying to replace Richard. What is also interesting is Alexander saying, like, you good? For a second, you look like you're gonna throw yourself in there. And Oliver says, oh no. And Alexander says, good, don't. Come on. It's fucking freezing. I'm not leaving you out here alone. So for an instant, Alexander was worried about Oliver potentially unaliving himself. And yet, the fascinating thing is that not that long later, Alexander kind of almost does. So I'm just intrigued that, like, we're getting this hint that Oliver could have maybe, is very subtle, that, like, I don't think I noticed it really before, but, like, Alexander was the one to stop him. But then it, like, happens to Alexander later, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know how to unpack this just yet. I'll probably think about it more, but, like, this, I don't think I noticed this before. Here's another instant where I think that moment of all of them standing on the shore watching Richard slowly die and making that decision, I don't think that actually happened, because once again, we're having Alexander say that, he was coming back from Colin's room. That's where I found him, wandered down here for smoke, and there he was. I didn't even think to check if he was alive. He seemed totally dead, must not have heard me. And the police, when Colburn is laying out the details a couple scenes prior, says that, like, Alexander came across him. So what if that was just the case? Like, Alexander just did come across him, that they never had that instant with all of them standing on the beach making this decision. Alexander, like, previously I talked about how, like, I'm driving myself crazy because I feel like I'm noticing more details about the crime, and I'm, like, questioning how did it happen, because of, like, Colburn saying that he drowned on his own blood, but, like, he was in the water supposedly, so you would think that he would have water too, like, drown on water too, but no. But then Alexander points out here, what's weird though? What? There was blood in the water but not on the dock. And I'm like, what does it mean? Like, how did this happen then? Did he fall not from the dock but from the shoreline? Like, or did someone drown him after beating him? Like, still there should be blood, so I don't know, unless they were both already in the water and they brought the weapon in the water. But, like, still, the scene ends on a very interesting note where Oliver says, when did we become such terrible people? And Alexander says, maybe we've always been terrible, or maybe we learned from Richard. And I don't think that's the case, but I love that Oliver is trying to push the blame onto Richard. I mean that they were always had that potential, but I think it was a combination of their own personalities, their own stress, the environment of the university that they're in, the pressure, and then you add on top that they slowly, steadily just became worse, like a very gothic element, which is why I think gothics are the close kissing cousins of dark academia. And it's that slow descent into, like, you lose your grip on reality and your psyche, and maybe just a combination of all their personalities and the worst parts of themselves just clashed. And they can't blame Richard solely, but Richard did have an influence, but you could also blame each other on making each other the worst versions of themselves, if that makes sense. In Act 3, Scene 13, we're getting our first glimpses of Alexander's descent, his gothic descent, his fall, his, the breadcrumbs leading to his later actions. And it is him digging to a pile of hash browns with characteristic relish, so that's his normal, but Philippa had bullied him out of bed for breakfast, insisting that if he skipped any more meals, he would simply vanish into thin air. So pointing out that he's taking Richard's death and what happened really hard, and we see it's going to continue. It gets worse. He leans into his worst vices. And again, we don't know if it was an accidental overdose or an intentional later. But it's... Again, I don't know if he's a red herring or if it's just him reacting like, you suddenly come face to face with death and then you're questioning your sense of mortality. But, like, it's fascinating that Alexander is the one that is hit pretty hard, almost the hardest out of this group. And I would love to unpack this more, like, just pick at his brain, but I feel like I don't know what to say about it. One, I kind of love that we're mirroring the beginning of the year, and in part it's showing that nothing has changed. It's exactly the same, but yet things have changed. But what's fascinating is when Alexander says, who wants to gather the mail? It's Oliver that says, why bother? We know what it is, which one mirrors what Alexander had said in the beginning of the year when they were first talking about roles. But what's odd is Oliver saying that, because in the beginning of the year he acted surprised when Alexander suggested that they already know who everyone's role would be, that everyone has a typecasting. But what's equally surprising is him saying it now, because then Pip says, you don't think it might be a little different this year? Because of course it would be different, because you're missing one of your key players. So you got to figure out who would play that typical role Richard would have played? Would it go to Colin, who you guys consider the Richard of the next year? Would it go to James, who can play similar roles to Richard? Who knows? What's also interesting is Oliver then saying, I don't know, sort of seems like they're trying to get back to normal. And like up to this point, it seems like to me, like he was trying to do that. Like he was trying to ignore Richard's death. Like everything he was doing leading up to that point was him trying to ignore Richard's death, especially when he was home for Thanksgiving break. And now he's saying that after that night with Meredith, you know, not just acting, but also kind of saying a very similar thing of like, you know, it seems like everyone's moved on. And now he's parroting her. What also stands out to me is Alexander saying, thank God, I am sick of being stared at, when they're like complaining about like everyone moving on. And it stands out to me because, one, they're actors, they enjoy people staring at them, but yet at the same time they don't, because we've seen cases of Meredith, like, you know, we've seen in the past that she doesn't like being stared at and accused and assumed that she is constantly a femme fatale, that she is that typecasting. But at the same time, we learned during the party scene, the after party for Julius Caesar, that all the theater kids were there and they were all still performing. That even in their normal lives, they're still performing a role. And usually they're very attention seeking, but here in this moment, this is the one moment where it seems like they really, not one moment, every time something negative happens, all of a sudden they don't want the attention. All of a sudden they don't want to play these roles anymore. So we're seeing it here with Alexander. We saw it previously with Meredith. And I'm not saying that they're not entitled to this, because they totally should be. They should be able to divorce their theater acting jobs from their personal lives. But the problem is that the reason why it stands out to me is because up to this point, there is a blurring of the line between reality and fiction, of where they start and end, where they end and the typecasting starts. So like there is an overlap and there is a blurring. So like I'm not saying that they're wrong, I'm just saying that it stands out to me. I also really love what Ren says here, that for days people keep looking around me as though I don't exist. And it stands out to me because in my last couple of videos, I keep talking about how we don't know anything about Ren. We don't know anything about her future. It's as if she doesn't exist anymore. Like, it was never brought up. And even throughout the rest of the story, she flits in and out the scenes as if flitting in and out of existence. Like, she's not as important. She's not as big of a player throughout the rest of this book, not as much as the other characters. However, she does become very important when all of a sudden she becomes a potential love interest with James, as she is tied with James. And like, you know, in that one brief moment, Oliver is fixated on her. Up to that point, I think like he notices she's not there, and then, you know, when she has that moment, but even then, Oliver doesn't really talk about her or think about her, not like in the way that he thinks about all these other characters. The only other character that flits in and out of attention is Pip. When Oliver says that Meredith gets up and goes around the room and everyone automatically gets out of her way, like they're afraid of, touching her or catching her misfortune, I felt a little snag of anger or anxiety. I couldn't tell the two apart anymore. After Richard's death, they were somehow indistinguishable. One, it is showing his savior complex, that, like, you know, Meredith being treated like this makes him angry. Like, he wants to step up and protect her, even though he calls her a whore. But also that it's, I think, giving us in that one brief line this warring emotions that he has within him, that he, especially when it comes to Meredith, that he wants to protect Meredith, wants to be with Meredith, wants to replace Richard in that sense, but is also knows logically that if he does that, he is putting himself out there for ridicule and attention, and that brings him anxiety. I love the little details of like them leaving Richard's chair empty at like both the castle and the library here, and even Richard's mailbox, and how like he's kind of annoyed and has to force himself not to look at the mailbox, and being like annoyed that they haven't removed it yet, because it is subtly like a telltale heart, that is subtle reminders that you can't forget him, despite them kind of hoping that they could forget him and move on. Okay, this is one of the cases where every time I read this book, my opinions change wildly, and especially with Oliver. So maybe the first and even the second time when I read Meredith saying like a date, and he says, I guess, I don't know, we'll figure out when we get there, I might have saw him, I feel like I did see him just nervous and like uncertain and afraid of being shot down. But in this moment, because I'm viewing him in a very negative lens, this read through, and I'm not doing it intentionally, it's just how it's happening, I think he's just being an asshole. So here, Oliver and all the other students are given the roles for their, Christmas mass, the Romeo and Juliet performance, and Oliver is given Benvolio, the sidekick, which fits his, typecasting, his archetype, which is also very interesting because he acted like in the beginning he didn't have a typecasting. Yep, hinted that he usually played the sidekick, so he did have a typecast because there usually is sidekicks in Shakespeare plays. But I think it's also showing in this case of him being cast as a sidekick that not much has changed. That for the most part, with all the roles for Romeo and Juliet, they're playing predominantly their typecasting still. It's not until Julius Caesar that they start breaking away a little bit more again. What also stands out to me is that Oliver had gotten up planning on leaving anyway, but yet at the very end of the scene, he notes that he left the refectory without going back to her table. Colin had taken my seat. He didn't have to point that out because he wasn't going to go back anyway, but he does, which stands out to me because that is Oliver's fear of being replaced, of not being important enough in this group that he could be replaced, which I think that little detail tells us that it is fuel for his fire of further giving him allowance in his mind to continue to do what he does going forward, that he needs to solidify himself in this spot at the school that he already just was shaken by the threat of not being able to come back this next semester. And so with Colin sitting in his seat, it is a visual representation of his greatest fear. So Act 3, Scene 14 opens with Oliver describing how James, Ren, and Philippa are locked in their rooms. And to me, it creates this imagery of a cell. And that makes sense because I feel like at this point, the castle is kind of like their prison. They're trapped within it. They're trapped within this place that they're being haunted. It's almost like being trapped in a haunted castle, being trapped in a crypt. They can't quite escape. And so they're now starting to segregate. They're starting to separate. They're not really they're together, but they're not together, which reflects how the rest of the story goes. While they are physically near each other, emotionally that found family sense is completely gone now. And I want to once again remind everyone that this story is being told to us a decade later, at minimum. So the little details, he's not going to remember. I'm going to bring up once again Serial, that famous podcast that really kickstarted the huge trend of true crime podcasts. And that's series opened with Sarah Kanan interviewing her nephew and his friends about a random date just 2 months prior. And none of them can remember exactly what they were doing. They were contradicting one another, except for one person, but that was because it was a very specific event that happened. While this year, a very specific event happened, because of that one event, it should sit in the forefront, but kind of make everything surrounding it blurry. You're not going to remember the exact details of things, as we know from false confessions and just eyewitnesses. They're not perfect. Your memory's not finite. So these details, such as Alexander not being there with the rest of them, and Oliver supposing that he's with Colin, is the closest thing to him being true, that he doesn't know. He's just guessing. But also, why point it out? There's a reason why he is saying that the other three are locked in the rooms learning their lines, that him and he would probably remember him and Meredith going to the bar, but that is actually true because I don't believe fully that they had a relationship. But why point out Alexander separated from the rest of them, except to paint this kind of foreshadowing of what's to happen later with Alexander, and the fact that he is the next to kind of fall, to almost die, that he's already kind of setting up that he is even farther away from the found family. And in my head, my first thought went to, maybe he's not with Colin. Maybe he is spiraling into a worse sense of guilt and depression, which is really fascinating because because he's the one that suggested it. So Alexander, this read through, has become the most fascinating character, and I really wish I could crack his head open and know what's going on in there. And I sadly have to just accept I'm never going to be satisfied. again, as a reminder, Oliver is most likely fictionalizing all this, so every little detail that he puts in here is there for a reason. For example, him pointing out that Meredith and him find like aren't alone at the boar's head surprisingly for a Sunday, really close to exams. And I was surprised that their usual table was commandeered by a gaggle of philosophy students who are arguing loudly about the significance of Ulysses of Megara's cross-dressing habits. And I'm like, that is so specific to tell us a decade later. There's a reason behind it. Now, I know very little about philosophy. Me doing research about this hurt my brain. So the basic thing I could come with is that Ulysses of Megara's philosophy believed in the good. It is the good and unity, that the good is reason, the good is God, the good is wisdom. It comes in many forms. There is no opposite of the good, supposedly. And what matters is that the moral good and the will of the good person to strive towards it. And I still don't understand, and maybe someone else can understand this better than I can, of why this is important to the story, besides, the good aspect, and the moral good, and the idea that there is no opposite of the good, as long as you have unity, which is, I guess you could argue, what they were trying to do by eliminating Richard, and there's wisdom to be held, maybe? I am not entirely sure. The cross-dressing is a little bit more easier to pick out because it goes back to Shakespeare and how originally no women performed, that the woman roles were performed by men. And then it also made me think of Pip, which I'm wondering, was there a point of this to then make me think of Pip? Because Pip is an enigma. I don't know quite what to think about her. What Oliver says here about his date with Meredith is very interesting to me, in one sense, because I don't really think that they were together, but if they were, say, together, him pointing out that their conversation was unexpectedly awkward, we made superficial, silly remarks about our speech assignments and the upcoming mask. And it's pointing out that they had nothing in common. The only thing that they had in common was that they were both a part of this very intense program and that one of their friends died. That was the only thing that their relationship's kind of hanging on. There's nothing about either their personalities or their lives outside the school that can allow them to relate and connect and have a relationship outside this one detail. And so their relationship was never going to flourish or go anywhere, in my opinion. But also, it's kind of like pointing out that I think it's Oliver showing that to him, Meredith is always kind of like an Aphrodite figure, that she is grander than life, that you hope to achieve it, yet demolish her and dismiss her like anyone would with Aphrodite, that she's cruel, she's mean, but you secretly still want her. Yet when you get her, she's not what you expected, and there's nothing there, nothing but the imagined desire that Oliver had for her. Also, Oliver saying it's weird not being at our normal table is a continuation of what I was just saying in that last clip of like being a really great visual representation of his relationship, not only with Meredith, but with the rest of this group, that the moment that they're taken away from their normal table, from their normal environment, their relationships fall apart, that they can't survive outside, just as his and Meredith is awkward right now because the only thing hanging on for all of them is, or the thing connecting all of them is Delacour in this intense program. But the minute that they're taken away, their relationships were never going to survive, even if Richard hadn't died. The only reason why his and Pip's still kind of do is because they're still clinging to that one shared detail, and that is Delacour. And literally, she brings him back to Delacour, where she's still living. That's the only reason why they're still connected. But if they had all gone their own ways, their relationship would have fallen apart. This found family would not have been sustained. I highlighted this the last time, and it stood out to me again this time, which is Oliver pointing out that the philosopher students still debating Ulysses' possible homoerotic obsession with Socrates. It sounded like wishful thinking to me. And to me, it stands out because we have to remember it's been a decade. He's not going to remember exact details of what someone was talking about at the table next to him. So he put it in here for a reason. And the reason is that I think it's too subtly inferred about his and James's relationship, that he's thinking about him and James as he's actively on a date with Meredith, which is always the case. Whenever he's with one of them, he's always thinking about the other. When he was with James during the break, he was thinking about Meredith. But also, it makes me wonder, is he talking about Oliver himself having a homoerotic obsession with James, because he did mention that he is pretty much obsessed with James, that like he doesn't like to share James. He talked about the relationship in Act 1. That is how he kind of described it. But or is it that James has a homoerotic relationship obsession, with Oliver? But we also have to take into account if this relationship actually did exist, or if Oliver's just fictionalizing it for this tragic play that he is performing for us in this moment. And I say that also because it sounded like wishful thinking to me, that this potential romantic relationship between the two of them was wishful thinking on Oliver's part, possibly, because it goes back into what the Cymbeline quote that he said in the prologue of Act 3, which is, wherein I am false, I am honest, not true to be true. So the things that he is saying sometimes are false, but there's honesty lying underneath it. So in this moment, it sounded like wishful thinking to me. A potential homoerotic obsession relationship between James and Oliver might have been just wishful. Am I overthinking this? Probably. But when he mentions that Meredith rested her hand on the table in the moment of rare bravery, going into his hero complex, I reached out and set my own on top of it, 4 of her fingers curled around 2 of mine. And it's the 4 fingers and 2 of mine that stood out. And I think it's representing that even though it's the 2 of them in that room, there's actually 4 at this table, that there will always be 4 around each other. And the 4 is James and Richard. That even when it's just the 2 of them, it's never just the 2 of them. There will always be James and Richard kind of hovering in the periphery of the relationship, their supposed relationship. So I thought what Meredith said last time was interesting, and I highlighted it when I was annotating this book, and I still think it is, when she says, it sounds callous, but I don't care. I don't want to just be the dead guy's girlfriend anymore. And I think it's her afraid of the typecasting, which is fascinating, because in the very beginning of the book, she mentioned how she doesn't want to be just seen as only the femme fatale, even in her real life, that she's more than just that. But yet she's kind of given an opportunity to break free of the femme fatale role and become something completely opposite, which is kind of the widow's role. But she doesn't want that, and I think in part because she still wants agency. She's still fighting for her own agency, not to be seen as just the femme fatale, the girl that you lust after but you never really want to be with, and associating, like, she sees value in herself only when others sees value in her, so she's constantly linking herself with other people, but yet she doesn't want to continue through her life kind of dragging Richard's dead body along with her, like he's tied to her like a weight, that she's just seen as this person, that she needs to move on to like break free of that. And Oliver, for instance, is that perfect opportunity to break free and become a different role, to have her own agency without realizing that she doesn't have agency really. She's still linking herself to a guy. Girl. I hate Oliver sometimes, because when he gets this moment where he can like have Meredith is within his grasp, he just chucks it back at her, that she's being emotional, being vulnerable, and he goes, I don't want that, and throws it back at her, just like how he did when she came onto him supposedly in the dressing room in the last act. She is saying that she needs to move on, and yeah, what she's saying is a little callous, and she's saying that it might sound callous, but I need to move on. And he's like, I'm not Richard's understudy, but yet you're vying to be. You want to be. But the minute that someone kind of vocalizes that, you chuck it back at them. You go, I don't want that, but really you do. Obviously you do. Your actions are saying that you do. You want that, and you want Meredith. But the minute that it seems like it's possibly in your grasp, you throw it back at them, which is so fascinating for Oliver's character. Like this aggressiveness, the moment that she's vulnerable with him every time. What Meredith says to Oliver in this moment, that, everyone calls you nice, but that's not the word, you're good, is interesting to me, because on one note, it's him trying to have someone else vocalize how he sees himself, like to not seem conceited, to be like, oh, I'm a nice guy, I'm the good guy, which we all hate, the self-appointed, I'm just the nice guy. Like, we have so many videos here on TikTok of people being like, those are the scariest guys. But by having someone else such as Meredith say it, then he's avoiding kind of that loophole, but really he's still saying it. He's just puppeting Meredith in this instance, because we've got to remember this is his story. But also, the good element makes me think back to the philosophy. Again, why bring up exactly what these philosophy students are saying unless it's important? And the philosophy of Ulysses of Megara is about the good, that there is no opposite. So I think what he's trying to say is that Oliver is trying to say that he's not nice, he's good, in the sense of Illicit of Megara's version of good. So the last time I read this book was when I annotated my copy, and a very big theme that I spent a lot of time thinking about and looking and marking was this blurring of the line between reality and fiction, that the school and the teachers and everything kind of created an environment where the students were unable to identify what was real and what was, fiction anymore, leading to the events that occurred in the story. And I'm bringing that up because I marked it here when Meredith said to Oliver, and you're real, you're the only one of us who isn't acting all the time, who isn't just playing whatever part Gwendolyn gave you 3 years ago. She is literally saying that I've lost the plot. I've lost reality. All of us, the rest of us, had lost who we really are. We're no longer who we were when we came into this school. We are now just solely our typecasting. Our personalities, our identities, our typecasting that was given to us by Gwendolyn. We don't know who we are outside of that anymore, except for supposedly Oliver, but Oliver does have a typecasting. They forget that his typecasting is the sidekick. And it's interesting that Oliver's trying to diminish it, acting like he isn't always that, because he is technically trying to break free from this supposed typecasting. He wants to be the hero. He doesn't want to be the sidekick anymore, is what is happening here. So there's this blurring of the line between reality and fiction going on. But it's also interesting that Oliver, once again, is having Meredith say this, because let's remember that Meredith is kind of a puppet in this instance, because this is Oliver's tale. So why is she saying this? Why is she pointing this out? And I think it's, again, going back to the Cymbeline line of wherein I am honest, wherein I am false, I am honest. Not true to be true. So what he is saying here, that you're real, that's not true. He was acting all this time. They were all acting all this time. Just as Colburn had said in an earlier scene that they didn't trust any of these students because they're all fucking actors, that they're probably lying all the time. And this, again, is him steadily pointing out to us, the readers, that I'm fucking lying to you. Eat this up. Believe it as true, because I'm presenting it as true, but underneath all this, I'm fucking lying to you. I highlighted this last time, and I don't know if I realized fully the extent of the importance of this, but it stood out to me, which is Oliver thinking that it should have been easy, but nothing between us ever would be. If this was what we wanted, we'd played foully for it. Talking about him and Meredith's supposed relationship. One, it's going to what I was saying before, that their relationship was never going to be easy, because the only thing connecting the two of them was their experience at Delacour and Richard's death. That's the only thing that they have in common. But also that we'd played foully for it. But in this presentation of the story, technically you didn't. Technically Meredith had already broken up with Richard when you supposedly hooked up, but you... So, are you saying that you two committed this crime? That you committed this crime? That she committed this crime? Like, how was this foully? Because in all technicalities, there was no foul, because if we were to believe the events of the story, Meredith and Richard were already broken up. They already were over when the two of you hooked up. So where was the foul? What I really love about the structure of the story is that after Richard's death, they leave. They have to leave. The school is forcing them to go away for Thanksgiving break. Normally they'd allow students to stay, some students to stay. And it almost is like a reset, is a restart, because then we see them come back and we're seeing them repeat what would be normal for them and repeat events that happened in the beginning of the book, which is them sitting around learning their lines, as we saw in Act 1, Scene 1. We're seeing now in Act 3, Scene 15, them about to do their auditions, which is very similar. The only difference is that Richard is gone and there is a gaping hole that we as readers can feel. Oliver doesn't have to address it. He doesn't have to point it out. We can still feel Richard's missing presence weighing down on them. As I've pointed out many times throughout this analysis, this plays that the students are quoting is very important. It tells us so much about it, telling us you have to do the research, or you have to be familiar with the plays, which I'm not familiar, so I did research. And the play that Oliver is using for his edition this time is from King John. First off, it is a completely different play than what he did before. He was playing more sidekick, leaning into that. Here he is trying to claim his spot. He is doing a king play, because this is another one of Shakespeare's history plays, and it's also a history play where a king is going to war against France, very similar to, I want to say Henry V. It could be the fourth. Don't quote me on it, but Richard quoted one of those plays and James quoted the other. Two of our main heroes. They are the biggest figures. They are the lead characters. They are the ones that are dueling it out. And here, Oliver is trying to throw his name into the hat by, quoting a king play. But not only is he also going to war against France, but it's going to war against France when rumors believe that his claim should be taken by his nephew to have the throne, which seems very fitting with events that have been happening in the last couple scenes, with Colin starting to make more of a presence in their little group and taking his seat at the table. And we already know that Colin was described in the beginning of this book as being the grade below Richard, playing a lot of the same roles. So it's very fitting that Oliver would be quoting a play about a king because he wants to replace this role, and the play would be about a different guy, a younger guy, having a better claim to this throne. Like Colin has a better claim to Richard's empty spot than Oliver. Like, it just to me, I think Frederick and Gwendolyn are very aware in this moment after Oliver's audition what is happening, what he is trying to do, which is trying to vie for the empty spot that Richard had left. He wants that spot. And I say that because Frederick and Gwendolyn were both smiling at me. Gwendolyn's mouth a bold slash of dark winter lipstick, Frederick's small, creased brow. And while they are smiling because I think they're happy that he's stepping up and trying to become a better actor, a part of them I think is looking a little worrying because Frederick's small, creased brow. Usually I feel like you don't do that when you smile. You're frowning, you're questioning, you're confused when you make that expression. And it's because up to this point Oliver hasn't been auditioning or vying for this specific position. Seems like he's been content with his sidekick role, but here all of a sudden he is trying to step into Richard's empty spot. So following Oliver's audition is Bren, and he's describing her as small and frail, and he's like, I didn't realize how small and frail she looked. The thing is that he kind of did describe her loosely in that sense in the beginning, that she is small, and even her coming back from Thanksgiving break looking tired and frail. So why is he putting more of an emphasis on it here? And I think it's just to point out like she's about to crack, which she is. But also that he describes like she was pale, dark circles showing beneath both her eyes, her face and hands pale. Ren tried to laugh but lurched into a deep cough instead. And it is the thing with plays is that they have to visually show you a lot of things. They have to show you what is going on underneath the surface, the turmoil going on, the guilt, sickness, whatever. And it has to be easily like seen by the audience. That is what Oliver is doing here with Ren in his description of her, because this is her fall, this is her Ophelia fall. He is painting her to become the Ophelia of the play, because in Hamlet, Ophelia commits suicide, dies, however you want to interpret it, after Hamlet caused the death of her brother and father. Ren's choice in play is equally fascinating because she's quoting Lady Anne from Richard III, which, first off, Lady Anne was Richard's wife, which is fascinating to me because while Ren is Richard's cousin, she's almost treated like a partner in the sense that she is constantly worried about his emotional state, like in an abusive relationship, where like you are constantly aware and like watching and trying to keep the abuser happy so he doesn't erupt, and usually erupts around you and her and Meredith would face the consequences, so they're constantly aware of him. But also that Lady Anne in the play knows that Richard is a fiend for and has killed her husband and father-in-law. Despite that, she allows herself to be manipulated and marry him. And I think that's what I think it's so fascinating, because it is so similar and so polarizing to Ophelia and her character, because while both have people close to them die from someone else that they supposedly need to marry or they supposedly love, one completely disintegrates and falls and dies, and the other kind of rises a little bit and becomes an ally. And I think she's trying to have herself become an ally a little bit with Lady Anne, but the problem is that she faints, she falls, and we never hear about her in the future tense when, Oliver's talking in the present tense, where she is and what she's doing in her life. So it's more likely that she became more Ophelia-like. And to continue off that, as I said, that she is treated almost like a partner to Richard in a very abusive relationship. She literally says, when the Lady Anne quotes, this was my wish, be thou, quote, if I accused, for making me so young, so old, a widow. And it technically she kind of is too. Like everyone just sees Meredith as a little bit of it, and Meredith, as she said in the previous scene, that she's ready to move on. She does want to be seen as the, you know, dead guy's girlfriend. I was gonna say ex, but like I think everyone else doesn't see her as an ex, only she sees herself as an ex. But so was Ren, because as I said, Ren was equally seen as a partner who had to take care of Richard and his emotions. The other important thing to note that stood out to me is, as I've mentioned, I'm not too certain about Oliver and Meredith's relationship because he flip-flops violently. He goes from, worshipping her to criticizing her to the worst degree, but he doesn't do that with Pip and Ren. And I think the reason is that Pip can be seen as one of the guys often enough. Whenever she is seen as a girl, it surprises him. But with Ren, she is the epitome of what a woman should be in Oliver's point of view and from what he's gathered from Shakespeare. While there are strong women in Shakespeare, a lot of the ones that we think of and probably what he thinks of is the softer, gentler, Juliet's, Ophelia's. That is who Ren is. That is the character she typically plays. So while Oliver does not want to be with her, he, I think, idolizes and appreciates, and that's why he doesn't really say anything negative ever about Ren. I'm up to Act 3, Scene 16, and in it, Oliver is saying, I was still shivering or maybe shaking like Ren, a symptom unrelated to the temperature outside. And to me, it's coming across as him kind of seeing Ren as the contagion to explain the rest of the group's like strangeness, the way that they react the rest of the book. But to be perfectly honest, they already had the disease, if we're going with that, metaphor. They already had that disease within them. It was already lying in wait. It was already kind of showing its head a little bit. Yes, Richard's death might have accelerated it, but it already existed. And they already were showing signs long before Ren did right here. They were already acting strange immediately after Richard's death. But it's fascinating that he's kind of treating Ren as like the first domino to fall for all their Gothic descents. Just as a reminder, we have to remember that everything that happens here is done intentionally, whether by ML Rio or by Oliver, because Oliver, this is his tragic play that he's been working on for the last decade, and he's now performing for us. So Pip and James being the first that he comes across after Ren's fainting and him being in shock about it, which, like, I don't know. Like, part of me feels like Oliver could be, but part of me feels like he's, like, hamming it up, I guess. But the fact that it's the two of them there to be concerned for him and comfort him is important. It stands out because, like, throughout the entirety of the story, they are the two that do look and are concerned and love him the most. And, like, Pip's the one that picks him up from prison. And I think the point of it is to show, like, these are the two most important people in his life, even if he doesn't realize it entirely, but also to make him likable, relatable, because it's so much easier to like a character when they have people that love them. That's why often we have villains, those caricatures of villains seem like loners, because it makes it easier for us to hate them. But the minute that they have people that love them and understand them and stand by them, it's a little bit harder. And I think that's what Oliver's trying to do, because when you strip it all away, Oliver is not a great friend, to be perfectly honest. He thinks about himself, he's possessive, he does not really care or comfort others that much, except for maybe James, and only sometimes. So the fact that others care about him, it makes it easier for us as the readers to like him too, because surely he's likable because someone likes him. James's reaction to Ren fascinates me because I never know how to think about James and Ren, that relationship, because a part of me wonders, was he leaning into it to make Oliver jealous? Like, that was my thought the last time I read this book, but like this time I'm wondering if he genuinely did have feelings for Ren and genuinely cared for her. Maybe he didn't really care for Oliver as much, or he dismissed or was trying to diminish his feelings for Oliver to move on, since Oliver obviously moved on to Meredith. But also it could be that, like, it's his guilt. If we are to believe that he did commit this crime, then maybe and we see as the story progresses how he has a very easily guilty conscience, that he then blames himself for Ren fainting because of probably him killing Richard. If he did kill Richard, then he's blaming himself for that. And so he's hovering around her a lot more in comfort, but I don't know. I don't think it's the last one because he was around her a lot prior to Richard's death. Like, they were getting close during Julius Caesar. There that moment when they're taking pictures, and then there's also like during the party they were close together. So like there was something there. I highlighted this the last time when Oliver says that James gave me one pained look, trying to communicate something I didn't have time to grasp before he turned and dashed down the stairs. But the last time I highlighted it because I was just highlighting any of the kind of cute moments between Oliver and James because I do like the relationship. I do find it cute. However, this time I'm viewing it very differently. And then this time I think that this is Oliver trying to leave the breadcrumbs. So, like, his final reveal would be too out of left wing, so then he can point out like, no, I love bread. Like, there's breadcrumbs showing that like James had done it, if James had done it. But it's we have to remember that nothing is thrown in willy nilly or just throwaway lines. Everything in this is done intentionally. Oliver had a decade to finite and clean and polish this play, this story. So every little detail is done with intention. I just don't know what the intention of this specific detail is. So the last time I read this book, I highlighted and annotated. This is actually my most annotated book I own. And I highlighted when Pip, pushes Oliver into a chair and says, just sit here a while and be quiet. You've done enough. And I literally put in my annotations, interesting choice of words. You've done enough. And I'm already... Oliver's my biggest suspect, to be perfectly honest. In this read through, I really think he did it. And I think Pip is maybe aware of this. And, like, she looked at him very curiously, like, during Julius Caesar, during other moments. She's had her eye on him, has been studying him. And I think she is wondering if he could have committed the crime. And that makes me now wonder, why would she pick him up after prison? I think it's to keep an eye on him. I think that she's afraid of what he could do, and it's just better to stay close and keep an eye on him, so then you're not, surprised. I think she wouldn't be surprised by that. I don't know. Who knows? But I think Pip knows more than what she is saying, and Pip is annoying because, in the sense that I don't know anything about Pip. We know so little, and I don't know what she's thinking or what she's intending, and I just want to dig in Pip's brain so bad. What Oliver says here is absolutely beautiful, and I love it. Beautifully represents kind of what the story does in a lot of cases, where it's telling you something that makes sense in the moment, but when you take a step away, it's telling you so much more too, in the sense that here he's saying that, like, I grabbed her, or Pip's, wrist, squeezed it much too hard in a strange fit of despair when Ren had lost her grip and slipped so quickly. I couldn't catch her, and now James had vanished too, out of the door and into the night, like water trickling through my fingers. I was reluctant to be left alone, more reluctant still to let another friend out of my sight, as though one or the other of us might simply disappear. Again, it makes sense in the moment, but again, it's also showing, like, his reluctance to move forward at away from Delacour. Like, his entire existence, his entire identity, he has fixated on being this found family at Delacour. He doesn't know who he is without them, and he's already sensing, thanks to like his date with Meredith, that outside the confines of their normality, they wouldn't be able to thrive. They wouldn't survive this relationships between all of them. And I think he is terrified of losing everything. And he, like, there's some, I don't know, my brain's just running a mile a minute, but yeah. This is another instant where I highlighted something because it related to a character the last time, because it's my green highlights and that's my character highlights, but I didn't realize there's more to it, or at least this time I'm seeing more into this, where he says that, Pip sank to the floor beside my chair and rested her head on my knee, saying nothing, simply waiting until I didn't need her there anymore. That last bit, saying nothing, simply waiting until I didn't need her there anymore. That's kind of how he treats her character in the story overall. She doesn't really push the narrative too much. She's just there when he needs her. Until he doesn't need her, then she disappears again. It's pops her up when it helps push the plot forward or push a certain narrative, or to make him more likable, to soften him a little bit, things like that, to be a motherly figure but then a bro. Like, she just isn't a full person, I think, and that's why like we don't know much about her. He just uses her almost like a prop and throws her in and out of scenes until, whenever he needs her. Oh, I see you, Amalvia. I see the little bit of foreshadowing because she's like, as they're waiting for like James and Ren to come back, Alexander has slumped sideways on the couch and fallen asleep, his face ashen and his breathing shallow, very much mirroring his breathing and his, complexion when they came across him during his near death experiences, either potential suicide attempt or just overdose. In the beginning of the scene, and then again when James returns, we are reminded that it is snowing, like the little details, like the snow clinging to James's hair, and snow has symbolism of it. Not only does winter represent the end of the life cycle, death, before spring's renewal, but also snow can represent emptiness and death, as I said. It can represent purity and freedom from sin, or half-life in hibernation. And it's so fascinating because I think all of these can apply. Not only is this like the darkest part of their lives at this moment before they had to crawl up, like Richard's death, and these moments here is where everything seems like it's at its worst. And I think Oliver, for instance, as our main character, has to make a decision of how he's going to move forward from this, and that decision is his actions of, replacing Richard, his actions of hiding supposedly James's weapons and things like that. That's where the story starts moving forward. But then also there's this emptiness. We see all of them in half-life. They're in hibernation. They're not like how they used to be. They're going through the motions, but they're not really invested. But then you also have the purity and freedom from sin. Ren has always been described as the ingenue. She is the sweet, innocent, pure girl, and she has fallen because of their sins. Has her fainting released them from their sins, or just highlighting that they're still in the depth of the aftermath of their sins? So then James tells him that he wasn't allowed to go see Ren, that so many other people went in and out. It was like Grand Central Station, but he wasn't allowed in. And that should stand out to us, and especially when he notes that Colburn was brought in, that they are suspicious of the students still, and that they're uncertain if, any of the other students, James included, had done something to Ren. It would make sense because Ren is the cousin, it's the next one within the group. Is something happening? So they're suspicious, and it should be steadily having us as the readers be suspicious and start questioning things too. What is also interesting is Oliver bringing up yet again the conversation he overheard between the two detectives, and that one said, "My money's on the cousin." Have we looked at Ren? There was no way that anyone would be truly suspicious of Ren, especially the magnitude and violence used against Richard. If he was poisoned, maybe, but no, that doesn't make sense unless they're assuming that she used, lured someone else into committing the crime for her. But like, why be suspicious of Ren? But also, why is Oliver pointing the finger towards Ren in this way? I honestly don't know. I would love for someone else to tell me, but like, I just want to flag that it's interesting that he's bringing this idea up again. Why is he bringing this idea up again? So with Alexander yet again saying that, no, we do nothing, is a great representation of what all the students are doing already, which is that they just do nothing. They keep smothering, they keep acting like nothing is happening, suppressing until eventually they explode. And Alexander is the more visual representation of that with his overdose. But then also he's saying that like we don't want them to ask all kinds of questions we don't want to answer. And Meredith says, who? The police? And Alexander says, no, the school. Which like, that's so fascinating to me, because like you would think the police, which then makes them like, others seem very suspicious. Like, oh, you don't want to have questions asked about this moment. Why? Because of the police. You would think that, but no, he says the school, which shows to us that, like Oliver, Alexander is secretly terrified of what would happen if he loses his place at the school, if he loses this opportunity that he has placed his entire identity on who he is at this school. When Meredith says, we did not kill him, and Alexander responds with, no, of course not. We just let him die. I think there's so much more being said there, besides the fact that, like, if we were to believe Oliver's version of events, like, they just let him die. They their inaction was action. They still played a role in that, but also you can argue that it represents all of them by not getting involved in stopping their worst selves, their inner demons that had been laying underneath the surface and had been exposed and allowed to flourish thanks to this university and thanks to these particular relationships. It led to all their downfall, that no one stepped in to stop it. They just let it happen, which, like, it's not on anyone to heal or fix or stop you. You have full agency, which is a part of the story, fate versus agency. You have full agency in your own actions. However, it again showing that, like, he's trying to act like they didn't, if that makes sense. Like, I don't know, like, there's so much more that you could argue is, like, represents a whole group and how their downfall for the rest of their lives happened because their worst selves were allowed to be exposed and flourish. It's important to note that after this confrontation, Alexander is the first to leave the room, which represents that he is going to be the next to fall. He's the next one that, has his crisis, that he almost dies too. He literally crumbles next. But also Meredith turning to him and going, what's wrong with him? And Oliver saying, I have no idea. One represents him trying to present himself like he is oblivious, but two, if he is oblivious, then why is Meredith turning to him to ask him what is going on with Alexander? Why would he know, potentially? One thing you may not know about me is that I love fashion, and more specifically costumes. I think that if it's done well, it should tell you a lot about a character or what is going on in that moment without actually telling you, whether it's in movies, shows, or books. And I'm bringing it up here because Oliver's describing the costume department for put them in for Romeo and Juliet costumes that they described as caravelle couture, but as far as Oliver could tell, adhered to no particular time period but called for a lot of velvet and gold embroidery. And it's the no particular time period that stood out to me because at this moment in time, the group is adrift. They are lost. They have no ground to hang on to. They are literally out at sea as we're seeing all of them uncertain and flailing. And I think it's very fitting that even though they are falling back on their comfort zone, which is Shakespeare, the fact that it has no time period means that there is nothing for them to hang on to almost. And so it's kind of ambiguous, and that's how they feel, that even though they're in their comfort zone at Delacour, they're still lost at sea. It's also really interesting that he describes that they made him look like, well, his particular costume, a musketeer, but a particularly flamboyant and well-funded one, because that kind of like goes with and against Oliver, because Oliver, yes, is the sidekick character, but he tries to paint himself like he's not active in this storyline. But musketeers are soldiers. They adhere to orders. They're fighting. They're knights. They're not like, typically the ones in charge. They're not the heroes. They're not the, kingly roles. They're not James or Richard. They wouldn't be musketeers. But Oliver would be a musketeer as a sidekick. But I like the particularly flamboyant, because flamboyant, especially at this time where this story is set in the 90s, mostly is connotated and linked to the gay community. When you're describing someone as looking flamboyant, you're kind of sometimes saying that they look gay. At least during that time, that's how you would describe it, which is so fascinating because at this period of time, Oliver is questioning his feelings and he is not completely certain. And I think his feelings are really being put under the microscope the minute that he started supposedly hooking up with Meredith. But then the well-funded one is just a dig at him because of his current financial situation, what happened after Thanksgiving break. So just reading the line of Oliver saying that James and the girls had already gone except Ren, who, as far as we knew, was still bedridden to the infirmary. I need to unpack that sentence a little bit more, and I'll do it in the next clip, but I want to just bring up how the first thing that came to my mind was about Ren, and how Ren just appearing in the next scene, it's gonna come up when they're performing Romeo and Juliet, so in Act 3, Scene 18, and she appears and he seems surprised because they just assumed she wouldn't be doing it, which is totally logical, but at the same time, I think he already dismissed her, because it made me realize that Oliver, at least this read through, I am seeing him as hungry. He wants so much more. And I think the best way for me to describe him is if you had seen Spirited Away by the same director, Ghibli Studios, who did, Howl's Moving Castle, that's very popular. There's a creature, a shadow creature, that initially in the beginning is very calm, very complacent, very helpful. But as the movie progresses and it starts getting more and more things, it grows more and more hungry until it is a full out monster that is devouring. And that is how I'm viewing Oliver in the story. That he starts off maybe calm and complacent and someone you can forget about, but as he starts to gain a little bit more and more and more, he gets hungrier and monstrous. Now going back to that sentence, it's saying James and the girls. First off, it feels like a band, kind of. James and the girls. But it's pointing out without pointing out that Alexander is not there with them, which is interesting because Alexander is technically the next to fall in this group, but also the girls. Because he doesn't have to say that because Ren isn't there. The only girls that they are is Pip and Meredith. And he could have said James, Pip, and Meredith had left, but he doesn't. He says the girls. And it was equally fascinating that he's linking or, grouping Pip in with the girls because sometimes he doesn't. And I think in her performance for Romeo and Juliet, I think she does play a male character. So it's so fascinating that he's roping Pip in with the girls category. And I think it has to do with the fact that the last scene, the way that she comforted him was a very motherly comforting of him. So now, instead of seeing her as one of his bros, he's seeing her as a motherly figure, and so he's just lumping her with the girls. And he doesn't know how to feel about Meredith, so she's just the girls. Now, I 100% believe that ML Rio does not do anything just because. She doesn't put them in particular scenes or situations just because. And when she has Oliver trying to put his boots on at the last minute, falls onto his bed and just finishes the job from there, why bring up the bed? There's no reason really, besides to not make it feel like a white room where we don't know where he is and what's happening with his actions. But the bed has so many symbolism. Now, my first thought immediately went to the fact that supposedly the murder weapon is hidden within James's bed. So I think it's interesting that it's being painted here, that in that moment I was like, oh, could he see the weapon? That was my first thought. But also the beds symbolize so much more. So beds can represent the need for rest, which they all need rest. They're still running at 1,000 miles per hour. They're still on that hamster wheel ever since Richard's death. The moments after that, they have not stopped running. But then also the desire for, safety, security, and stability. Oliver, because of recent events with Richard's death, with, Colin looking like he's going to take his spot, or the spot that he wants, which is Richard's spot, his, place at Delacour thanks to financial situation, he feels like everything's unstable. And so he sits on the bed and finishes the job there because it gives him a sense of security. But beds also represent regeneration, which I think in this moment, from him coming off that bed, that is a new version of Oliver. I think Oliver goes through multiple regenerations in this story, kind of like the Doctor from Doctor Who, where after certain events we see a slightly different version of Oliver, like he had shed his skin like a snake. And so the version of him coming off this bed is going to be a little bit different than the version of him that had existed prior to being on that bed. Then you have beds to represent love, death, birth, all those kind of things. But that's what I think the bed represents, because I think she does not put things in just because. It can mean so much more, and beds too, because for instance, when I did my Crow Prince analysis, I talked about how Carden and Jude going to the High King's bed represented them leaning into the role finally. And when they finally had sex, it wasn't on the bed, it was on the floor, because they wanted to have sex just as them, not as their titles. So beds mean a lot. And to continue with my regeneration thing, he talks about his mask immediately following. He says, my mask sat on the nightstand watching me with hollow eyes. He is gonna be putting a mask on. That is what he's gonna stand up in this bed. He is regenerating as someone new, and he's gonna put this particular mask on. He's gonna become this new person, this new character he is gonna try out. What is equally fascinating is that he points out, because he doesn't have to, but he points out that these masks were specifically made for each of them, that they would only fit them so they can keep the mask, which to me stands out because as I've been pointing out, he's been trying to replace Richard. He's been trying to put Richard's mask on. So he's trying to say, like, oh no, like I obviously haven't been doing that. He's trying to like subtly tell us, like, no, I'm definitely not doing that, but you're definitely doing that. But he also kind of isn't. So maybe his regeneration is that he's not trying to be Richard, but he is gonna take a new place. He is going to step into power. It's just not, he's not going to step into being exactly a carbon copy of Richard, but he will take Richard's power, is what he's hoping. Maybe. Okay, so when Oliver said that Alexander was in the library, it stood out to me because that was exactly where he's seen Pip. That is also exactly where they hang out to learn their lines. Now, the symbolism of libraries typically represents the desire for wisdom and understanding, but also the thirst for exploration and curiosity. And it's interesting when you think of especially the last two interactions where he came across Pip in there and now Alexander, because these are the two characters that are the biggest threat, I think, if Oliver had done it, because they're more observant and they're like more so than anyone else, as they've shown it time and time again in little moments of little noticing of the group's dynamics and relationships and things, but also that they are more likely probably to figure out who done it. And like the fact that Alexander is doing drugs in here is showing that he is willfully trying to make himself one, because this particular drug is going to muddle his senses and alter it. So like it also then plays into how Alexander's response every time has been, let's not dig into this. So I think Alexander has the potential of uncovering this knowledge, but willingly decides to not do it, which also fits with him suggesting that they don't save Richard, that their inaction is their action, and he suggested that, and that's kind of what he's doing here, that him and Pip, I think, are similar in that sense, that they both have the potential of uncovering things, whereas Pip steadily tries to do it about drawing so much attention to herself, whereas Alexander willfully decides that he does not want to do that and will literally do things to harm himself because he would rather not know the knowledge. I don't know if any of that was coherent. It was a lot of rambling. I hope it was coherent. Alexander quotes The Tempest, which, as I pointed out before, Emilio puts Shakespeare plays in specifically, and it's meant for either people that are familiar with these plays or for you to go out and check, because it's telling us a lot without telling us. And so The Tempest is a play with a major act of betrayal, ill treatment, and a plot of revenge, which is very fitting obviously with the story. But like, who's being betrayed? Does Alexander feel like he is being betrayed? Is that why he is quoting that? Is there ill treatment, like he's being treated ill because maybe he does hate that he is typecasted as a villain, and they treat him and they assume that he would have done it, so maybe that's what he's afraid of. That's why he is pushing them all away from digging in or letting the police dig in, because he's afraid that because of his typecasting he would be the first suspect. For instance, does he felt betrayed by Richard? Like, who knows what the betrayal is? I could unpack that forever. But also a plot of revenge, because he was technically the one to suggest revenge when it came to Julius Caesar, not the killing but the fighting back. But we also have to think of The Tempest sharing a similar root word of temptation, and we see currently in this moment Alexander leaning into temptation of his drug addiction. Or is the betrayal coming from Oliver, where he feels betrayed by Alexander, that he thought that maybe he would be the person that would stand by his side and help move them forward, but obviously Alexander is crumbling beneath their eyes. He is struggling, and he kind of feels strangely betrayed by that he's feeling this overwhelmed by Richard's death, where I think Oliver might have expected Alexander to be eager that he had died, to be happy about it and eager to move on and pick up the pieces like they were supposed to, that it was supposed to be good. It was supposed to be good like how Julius Caesar had died, but Julius Caesar dying didn't automatically lead to good things. It led to some problems too. So I highlighted this line last time because I think it was really beautifully written, but I think it also represents so much when he says, "The cape hung heavily on my shoulders, but the cold crept underneath, gnawing at my skin through the thinner layers of my shirt and doublet." And I think it's representing that the cape, which is part of his costume, is hanging heavily because, he's trying to put on the old costumes of doing Shakespeare plays and hopes that they can just move on and go back to how it was before Richard's death. But it's not. It's pretty much as if Richard's death is hanging on with that fabric. It's weighing them down. The guilt is still there. And then the cold creeping in, because cold, it's the middle of winter right now. Winter means death. It means the end of a cycle. And despite Oliver trying to ignore that, ignore everything that happened and kind of act like everything's fine, everything's normal, it's gnawing at him. It is seeping in. He can't avoid and ignore. Case in point with Alexander here. You can't ignore what happened. Alexander is crumbling. So the last time I read this book, I annotated it, and I annotated and highlighted these moments where Alexander grabbed Oliver's arm and wrenched him to face forward, and he was still holding my arm too hard, fingers crushing down through the muscle until they reached bone, which is mirroring Richard, what Richard did to James and Meredith. And that plays a role into what's going to happen when I get to Alexander's overdose scene, because his overdose scene, the way it's painted, it mirrors very much to Richard's, to the point where they're all standing over him deciding if he's worthy of saving. And what's fascinating is that the two are very similar. They had very similar experiences leading up. They were both violent, but yet Alexander, they decided, was worthy of saving. And I talked about this more in a video last year, and I'll put it down below if you want to check it out. Just as a reminder, Oliver is putting everything in here intentionally. He's had a decade to write this play. And when he says, "I swear I'll kill you," to Alexander, that stands out, because that is very violent. And to me, I think it's going back to the semilingual of wherein I'm false, I am honest, not true to be true. And he is pretty much saying here that he maybe should be the main suspect, because maybe he did kill Richard, and he might be willing to kill Alexander if it threatens everything for him too. But I also love when he says that he stared at me mask to mask, which is saying that they are both wearing masks right now. With Alexander pretending like everything's fine and he's not crumbling, and then the mask of Oliver is putting on, trying on this new role, that they're both staring at each other. They're not unmasked. They're not, at the most vulnerable. They're still lying to each other. And then Alexander says, "What's gotten into you? You don't sound like yourself." And that is to point out that Oliver is being different. That, going back to what I said in the beginning of the scene of the bed representing a regeneration. Him getting out of this bed is going to be a new version of Oliver, and we're already seeing it here. And Alexander's already noticing it. He is being more commanding, more demanding. He is leaning into power, taking on a little bit of Richard's personality in the process. He's turning into someone different. He's wearing a new mask. This is a new version of Oliver that we're going to see throughout the rest of the story. I'm up to Act 3, Scene 18, and I just want to preface this scene by saying that this is my favorite one in the entirety of this book. When I read this book the first time, I actually listened to it as an audiobook, and when I got up to the scene, the narrator's performance of this scene was spellbinding. And by that, I mean, I was in the middle of doing, my makeup, crafts, chores, something like that, and I just remembered I completely froze and was staring off in the distance, and when the scene was over, I realized I would stop what I was actively doing. I didn't even realize, because I was that engrossed by the scene. It was so brilliantly performed that I went back and re-listened to that scene one more time the next day before I moved forward. Did not do that for any of the other chapters in this book, but this scene, just amazing. Just as a reminder, the last time I read this book was when I annotated it, and not only did I highlight the line when he described the where they'd be performing, the ballroom where they'd be performing, and they said a sparkling glass atrium that stabbed up to the sky. I underline stab because, one, that is such a visceral kind of imagery, which you can immediately imagine what the ceiling looked like, but also the use of stabbed because of how Julius Caesar was stabbed. We can think that even Richard technically wasn't stabbed, he was beaten, but still fascinating. I didn't highlight this the last time, but it caught my attention this time when he's describing the room. Continuing, he says, "The marble floors have been polished to such a high shine that the partygoers might as well have been walking on mirrors." Very descriptive and setting the scene. It's not a white room, but also the mirrors, because mirrors represent a lot of things, but it shows your true self. It's most commonly the representation of mirrors, and the fact that the room that they're going to be performing in is described as a mirror is fascinating, because one, the actors are putting on masks, not only physically but figuratively. They're putting on masks, putting on a show, but so are all the partygoers. They're acting like they are partygoers of the scene that's happening, Romeo and Juliet, that they are part of the scene. So everyone's putting on an act, but yet the floor is reflecting their true selves. And in this moment, in this scene, we are going to see later that Oliver's real feelings for Oliver for James is revealed at the end, that it's reflected finally. Oliver then goes on to describing the weeping fig trees that grow into deep square pot planters in each corner. And fig trees, the symbolism is like abundance, wisdom, and success, but also the cycle of life. Now, wisdom and success makes sense because I think in this moment, in this scene, I think Oliver was hoping that this would skyrocket and pivot him towards more success in his career now that Richard is gone. But also wisdom, because not only do we see later in this scene, Oliver finally gaining wisdom of his feelings towards James, but I think other things could potentially be revealed, but I don't want to say just yet until I read a little bit farther in the scene. But also the cycle of life, which is what I'm talking about. This is the dead of winter. This is the end of a cycle, a death of something, the end of an age. And, this is the moment that will skyrocket and pivot Oliver, and he's hoping that he will be able to step forward after this night into his new life, his new path, now that Richard is out of the way, possibly. Now, I will admit once again that I am very suspicious of Oliver this time. I'm viewing him very more critically. But when he's describing that the performance starts, Alexander went immediately forward into the crowd, a tall, imposing figure in black and silver and serpentine green. I lingered at the door, waiting for the stairs to subside and then begin to slow, inconspicuously walk around the edge of the room. And I think that's how they view things too, like how they have done things. Alexander is the first to barge in and go, we should retaliate against Richard. We should just let be. Don't save him. Like, it's Alexander that, points this out. Where Oliver is slithering, I feel like, in the background, if we were to go with my theory that Oliver potentially had committed the crime. Oh, and to continue off that, like, even the story, he's trying to slither himself away in the background. Like, he's not really involved. He's not part of the story. He didn't really act on anything. It's everyone else and everything else that caused these things to happen. But in actuality, he's still a player in the story, maybe even more active than he's trying to present himself. So that line also mirrors the entirety of this story. What's most fascinating is the casting of this performance because it's showing nothing has changed. Not like how Oliver has hoped it would with Richard now gone. Of course, James is Romeo. Of course, Ren is Juliet. Of course, Tybalt is being played by Colin. And don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty certain that when Oliver earlier in the book was describing the kind of roles Richard would play, I think Tybalt was one of them listed. So of course Colin would be that, but I could see Oliver maybe not really thinking too hard about the fact that of course he's playing Benvolio, the sidekick to Romeo, which is something that he does like, but at the same time I think seeing Colin in a role that Richard would have played probably fueled his fire a little bit and annoyance and like being like, why didn't I get this role? But additionally, it is the prince being played by Meredith, which makes sense. She is very regal, but in my opinion, it is showing that she is the one actually secretly in charge. She is the one that is actually picking up the discarded crown. That she kind of is working in the background. We may not be realized, just as the prince and Romeo and Juliet is kind of working in the background, but also dictates the end events and the outcome. And Meredith is the one, who we learn later in this book, goes to Colburn and says, you need to look into this, and points him in the direction. So I think it's fascinating that Meredith is picking up the crown, and here she's being played as, the princess role. Then Oliver describes how him and Colin, fight for the performance, and he says that Colin charged at me, and we crashed together like a pair of gamecocks, which is very strong words used. Crashed, charged, things like that. But then he says a little bit later, I took an elbow to the chin and fell heavily on the floor on my back. Colin was on top of me in an instant, reaching for my throat, but I knew Aeschylus would arrive in time to forestall my strangulation. And it is mirroring to a T what Richard had done during Julius Caesar's, but not only that, what Richard had done to James in the Macbeth after party. It is a mirroring with a person that is considered as Richard's understudy. Colin is considered and been called since Act 1, Scene 1 as Richard II. And yet, in this moment, he says, I knew someone would arrive in time to prevent my strangulation, yet he didn't think that he knew that whenever Richard performed that. And I wonder also if it's mirroring what actually happened the night of Richard's death, but like the fact that he says, oh, it's fine. I knew Colin wouldn't do that. How do you know? Because this is very, very similar to how Richard had performed. What is the difference? And it's the same thing when we later get to Alexander's overdose scene. Why was Alexander deemed worthy of saving but not Richard, when Alexander has actions that we're going to see in this scene with him acting violently towards other, acting mirroring pretty much Richard's actions, but yet Richard was not deemed worthy of saving. Richard was deemed someone to be scared of. So, like, that is the fascinating thing about this book, especially in the second half, where we have characters that are doing the exact same thing as Richard, but yet they're deemed worthy of saving, but not Richard. Meredith's line here, I believe, is a little bit foreshadowing, because as she is the prince talking down to all these men and being like, stop your fighting in Verona, she lifts only Oliver's chin and says mostly to him, if you ever disturb our streets again, your lives shall pay the forfeit of the peace. And I say it's foreshadowing because in the prologue of Act 3, at the very end of it, Colburn notes that Meredith had come to his door dressed glittering like a Christmas tree and had pointed him the direction. And when Oliver says, when did that happen? Probably the week we arrested you. So this is she comes to him later, like during their kingly performance, so later in this book. But in this moment, I think she is threatening Oliver, saying that if you disturb her peace, if something happens, I will pretty much go to the police. And she may not be fully aware of what she is saying here, but this is what she is saying pretty much, which, like, it's interesting that she's saying this to Oliver instead of, saying it out to who she thinks it could have been. Like, she could have been looking in the crowd for Alexander, for James, if she thought it was them, but no, she looks at Oliver. Again, I'm very pointedly believing Oliver committed it. This is very true, so that's why I'm looking at it that. But even then, it's still a bit of foreshadowing because she is the one that goes to the police. What's fascinating is that Oliver's trying to act like he doesn't have a typecasting in this entire book, but he really does. It's sidekick characters, and it seeps into his real life, which makes it even more fascinating of him trying to push away and believe that he really doesn't have it because it seeps through their everyday life. And we see it even here when he's performing Portfolio, when he says, where is Romeo? Saw you him today, right glad I am he was not at this fray. It mirrors so much of Oliver and James's real life relationship, or at least this version of their real life relationship, according to Oliver, because there are so many moments that we get this sense that Oliver would have jumped in the fray. He would have fought and done anything to protect James's innocence, because the way that he describes James a lot of times is very childlike, that he's too pristine, too perfect, too innocent to have done this, but then all of a sudden to have him committed this crime, have blamed him. It's possible. Possibly Oliver had never seen the real version of James and isn't telling us that version of him, trying to create this very interesting twist, this very interesting, tragedy. But at the same time, it makes it slightly unbelievable, and that's why I have never really believed that James had done it, no matter how many times I've read this book. I know some people do, some people don't like James, but I personally just don't believe it. And then wonderfully, because it's been a while since Oliver has said something in line with this, he says that when James comes out, he's looking at him. He says, see where he comes to the girl nearest me, in a softer tone. That strange possessive pride washed over me again. Everyone in the room was watching James. How could they not? But I was the only one who really knew him every inch. And so, he literally said early on that, James was his. He is very possessive of James, that, he doesn't like if James has other friends pretty much. And so it makes sense that he would be very frustrated in seeing that James has a relationship with Ren. And, I wonder if he really didn't have sexual, feelings towards James. It was just a possessiveness, and he didn't like that he was steering towards someone else, maybe. And so he misinterpreted it as sexual feelings. But, it then makes sense of why Oliver could have committed these crimes, committed these actions, because he was doing it to protect James, to keep him close, keep him safe, because he saw ownership of James. This is one of the reasons why I really love the scene when Oliver describes him and James that we argued lightly about his unrequited love, a game emerging where I blocked his way each time he tried to leave, attempting to evade my questions. He was content to play along until at last he said more firmly, farewell, my cuz. And when you read it the first time, or just, on the surface level, or hear it, it's so delightfully, playful. It's this really cute kind of moment, up to this point we're already sensing this romantic tension between Oliver and James. So seeing this is just fun. It's nice. It makes me smile. But then taking a step back, now that I'm looking a little bit deeper, peeling back the top layer, it's insidious, I guess you can say, because literally just right before Oliver described his possessiveness of James, so he's not blocking him in a playful way, he's blocking him from leaving him. Like, he doesn't want James to leave him. He said throughout this book that James is his friend. He doesn't want anyone else to be close to James. He's kind of that abusive relationship, and he has continuously blocked him. And up to this point, to this scene right here, throughout this book, from Act 1, Scene 1, all the way up to here, Act 3, Scene 18, James has played along. He has laughed it off. He's been playful every time I think Oliver has stepped in his way and blocked him. But in this moment right here, we're going to see James more firmly say, farewell, and try to sidestep Oliver. And at least to Oliver, it looks like he's sidestepping him for Ren. And it's fascinating that this little line right here represents the entire structure of their relationship, that up to this point, it was playful, but going forward from here, it's going to be a lot more strained. And to continue, Oliver then says, "Soft, I will go along, and if you leave me so, you do me wrong." Which is reflecting how he feels when he feels like James is leaving him, turning towards someone else, turning towards Ren. Oh, these lines are chosen so specifically. Like, yes, they fit the scene that they're performing. But when James says, "Tut, I have lost myself. I am not here. This is not Romeo. He's some other where." It goes back to what he had said in Act 1, his biggest fear, which is that he gets lost in the characters and he can't seem to find his way out as the years have gone on. But, like, it seems like it's saying so much here that, like, as we see, at least the way that Oliver presents James going forward, that he is lost. We saw this at Thanksgiving, that he seems lost and uncertain of who he is and what is going on, and I think he's scared. And he was scared before because he wanted to break free of his typecasting, and then what happened with James, like, I think he was on the precipice of already, like, cracking and everything's just spiraling. But I think he's equally saying that I'm not Romeo. I'm not this person. Like, Oliver paints him as Romeo. Oliver paints him as whatever typecasting character he performs. And he's trying to say, I'm not this hero person. Look, you claim that you know every inch of me, but you really don't. When Oliver says that my desire to keep him there had at some point transcended the alignment of an actor's motivation and his character, and then also later says, I forgot which line of mine followed. We stared at each other and the crowd faded around us. It's the blurring of the lines between reality and fiction, which is one of my colored tabs I have here. It was something I fixated on when I was annotating this book, which is this blurring of the line between reality and fiction that these students have, that they no longer can decipher what is real and what is fictional, what is their characters and who really they are, because the line has been blurred so much that they don't know who they are. It goes back to what James just said. This is not Romeo, he is some other where. He doesn't know who he is. He gets lost in his character. So do all of them, and it's because of this blurring of the line between reality and fiction, I think, allowed the possibility for this murder to occur, that they've lost who Richard really was, his real person. They only saw him as the characters he played on the stage. And it's so fascinating because then you compare it with Alexander and Colin, who, for some reason, Oliver sometimes can step back and remember that they're not quite their typecasting, but sometimes he does think that they're typecasting. Going back to what he just said with Colin, that he knew that Colin wouldn't strangle him, someone would come in and intervene, but he didn't think that with Richard. So there's this blurring of the line between reality and fiction. And the blurring continues because then you have Alexander performing his character, say, "Nigh, gentle Romeo, we must have you dance." It is Alexander, kind of pushing the others towards a particular action. We see it in supposedly real life, but we see it also with the characters he plays. So there is a blurring between who the actual person is and then who the typecasting that they're typically playing. Alexander and James's lines here when they say that, I dreamed a dream tonight, and so did I. Well, what was yours? That dreamers often lie in bed asleep while they do dream things true. Made me think of the quote, Cymbeline quote that Oliver had said back in the prologue of Act 3 to Colburn. He said, "Wherein I am false, I am honest, not true to be true." And it's saying here that, the dreamers often lie, that this is a performance. This is a play that Oliver is presenting to us, is performing for Colburn. it is a lie, but through this dream of what this events could have been like, he is trying to make it into truth. Maybe. This is the scene where I'm talking about, where later events where they deem Alexander worthy of saving but Richard's not. Fascinated because in this moment he is performing his role with such violence, very very similar to Richard's, but yet they were frustrated and wanted to retaliate when Richard did it. But it's fine when Alexander does it here, because he describes how Alexander had seized James, that their foreheads and their masks knocked together, Alexander holding James so tightly. I heard him grunt in pain. I started toward them, but as soon as I moved, Alexander shoved him back right into my arms. Then he says things like, his voice and movement both grew more sensual, more savage, until he completely lost control and lunged at me. I staggered backward, but not fast enough. He grabbed me by the hair, bent my head back against his shoulder, snarling in my ear. Or when he says that I strained against his hold, but his strength was iron, overwrought, at odds with the delicacy of one fingertip tracing the embroidery on my chest. James, who had been watching frozen stiff, fought off his paralysis and pulled Alexander off me. And so, it's this, very violent actions that if Richard had done it, they would have retaliated, apparently. But also, what they said here where James is fascinating, that James stood there paralyzed, frozen. And I think that is James's natural reaction, that he freezes. So that leads me to believe that James wouldn't fight back, most likely. And here he is also, even though he is in character, he is trying to, bring Alexander back, tone him down by holding his face in his hands. He didn't have to hold Alexander's face in his hands. I think he's trying to calm Alexander down, which is proving my theory that James has always been the peacekeeper. He's the one, and so many scenes leading up to this, we see trying to bring the tension down, to alleviate the tension and calm things and not escalate it. It is Oliver and Alexander that escalate things. Going back to the blurring the line between reality and fiction, he says that, in there, faint and ethereal as a ghost was Ren. A blue and white mask framed her eyes, but she was unmistakably herself. That leading up to this performance, she was sickly, she looked out of character, she seemed off, but the moment that she's there, dressed as Juliet, she seemed like herself, which you might see oh, she's healthy again, but I think it shows that to him, when they're out of their characters, they're not really them anymore to Oliver. So the moment, though, that Ren is playing her typecasting, she is unmistakably herself. So Oliver ends not only this scene, but Act 3 entirely with him saying James was in love with Ren and I was blindly, savagely jealous. Now, jealous is a common theme in a lot of Shakespeare plays. For instance, it's in Cymbeline, which is a play that both only Oliver and Meredith quote, but it's also, for instance, a theme in Othello. And I think jealousy is going to play a role not only up to this point, but going forward, because jealousy can come in many forms. Yes, it can come in a romantic form, but jealousy can be for the power someone might have, for the roles someone might have, for the popularity someone might have. And I think Oliver is constantly fueled by jealousy. He is jealous of Richard's power and influence and roles. He is jealous, I think, slightly of James for the roles that he does have and the sweetness of him, and the others love him. He says that he walks in the rooms and others love him instantly, and he is jealous of all this. And seeing in this moment, he is savagely jealous because, just as he said during this performance, that he would be wrong if he left him, pretty much. He is terrified that he would lose his ownership of James, and James is turning towards Ren. But what's fascinating also is that you see this jealousy going on between Meredith, James, and Oliver, that there is this kind of love triangle going on, or arrow, however you want to describe it. But I had a video that I made last year, which I'll talk about, which is that it seemed weird with the evidence being on James. It just didn't make sense. So I had a theory that what if Meredith had planted it out of jealousy, just as Iago had planted the handkerchief on Desdemona to fuel Othello's rage and jealousy there. So I wonder if something's like that. But yeah, I think I'm definitely going to keep jealousy in mind with the rest of the story going forward.